was a student at church camp one year, much like our students just got back from, and it was about halfway through the week, from what I remember, and I was a teenager, and having a great time, doing my own thing. You know, camp is kind of fun because you got to have a little bit of freedom for the first time and roam around with your friends and go to stuff, and you had things to be at every day, but it was a lot of fun. I enjoyed it, and one day, the pastor of the camp said, hey, you need to stick back in our cabin, which is where we were all staying. He said, you need to stay back here today. And I was like, but it's free time. I want to go have fun with them. And he's like, oh, I really need you to hang out. And I was like, okay, all right, whatever. And I didn't understand why. And then, I can't remember exactly, but it seemed late afternoon. I was like, this is crazy. Why am I here? And my dad showed up. And camp was a good 2-3 hours from my home. And so I was like, that's weird. Like, you know when you see someone, you don't quite recognize them because they're out of context, they shouldn't be somewhere. It took me a second. I'm like, what are you doing here? And then came the bad news that my grandfather, who had gone in for a routine heart surgery, had died on the table. He had not made it through the surgery, and that was in Tulsa. And so he was there to pack me up, take me home, to be with the family, and to go to the funeral. And it was just like a gut-crushing moment, right? And that drive home, I remember, was pretty quiet. And I remember just, entering that space and all the emotions with that and the pain of that. And then came time for the funeral, which was not in my home church. So it was not in the church that I attended and was baptized in, but it was in my grandfather and grandmother's church. And so we went to that church, and I'd been there as a kid some. We went to that church, and it was full of people. He was well known in the church. It was full of people. And I was up in the front with the family, obviously. And as we walked out, at the end, I noticed that my pastor from camp had come to the funeral, and he was in the very back, just quietly. He had not, made a big production out of it or come up and said something to me as I, when I entered pastoral ministry, I always felt like I had to have something to say. I had to have the answer. He didn't say a word to me, but he was there. His presence was there. And then when I finally did see him, he just put a hand on my shoulder, and that was it. And I tell you that now, 35 some years later, because it still sticks with me that he walked with me through that difficult time. He showed up. His presence mattered way more than anything he had to say, and has informed a lot of who I am today as a pastor in that job and in that function. And what I want for us is the same thing, that we come to a point of realization and transformation that the messaging out there is pretty poor on what it means to be a Christian and what it means to follow Christ in this culture of this country. It has gotten, because we have so many denominations and so many people with freedom of speech is wonderful, but we have so many divergent ideas that it's gotten so diluted from what Jesus was actually doing that it can become very confusing, to the point where maybe you're like me. Sometimes I see people say, I'm doing this in the name of God, and I'm like, you're absolutely not. I don't know who you're doing that in the name of. I don't know where you got that idea, but you're way off, wacko. You ever feel like that? You ever see someone and you're like, I don't know who you're talking about. Like, that doesn't make any sense. What you're doing is the antithesis of what Jesus would be doing. And so I said a few months ago about the WWJD bracelets that were popular when I was a student, and then someone said, hey, I still have one. Are we asking that? Because I am afraid that sometimes we aren't, and we've gotten so far off course. Well, one thing that Jesus was really good at, it wasn't always having all the answers people demanded of him. People were asking him questions all the time. He wasn't responding sometimes, but he was there with them. His presence was there. And so for us, as I said, what I want us to have and what I want us to understand and to grasp is that our presence is way more than just attendance. Our presence, being present in the moment, is a way to serve others. And we can encourage people and we can lift them up. And so that's what we're going to dive into today, because our culture is just consumed right now. Our culture is consumed with, whether you want to call it overwork or busyness or whatever you want to call that, it's this tendency to just always be busy, to always be running to something else. And it's almost like if you say, if someone says, what's going on in your life? And you're like, oh, not a lot. I'm really restful right now. they're like, oh, that's awful. That's terrible, right? You've got to look busy even if you're not busy. Americans invented drive-thrus because we didn't want to go into a restaurant and sit and wait for our food to get ready, and we don't even want to get out of the car, right? Microwaves because we can't wait to cook something in the oven. We've got to shoot radio waves through that to get it faster. And so we are just constantly pushing ourselves to be faster and faster. AI, now, I can't even take 5 seconds to write an email, right? Because I want AI to write that email for me. I'm not saying I'm not guilty of this. I absolutely know sometimes that I lean on that or Grammarly to check my grammar because I'm like, I don't want to go through and make sure all my commas are right. They're never right. And I need something to help me, right? So we are all kind of falling into this busy, busy, busy. And so one thing that church does, instead of just being another thing on the calendar, if you think about it that way, I would love to help shift your thinking to look at it as a pause, as a moment to help us reframe where we're at. Because I like to think about church as kind of a refueling moment, a time for us to rest, to try to quiet out those intrusive thoughts for a moment, to try to connect with God, to hear from Him. And if we're honest, not every Sunday does it work out that way. Just doesn't, But if I put myself in that path, then there's a lot higher opportunity and chance for that to happen. If I come with the right frame of mind, if I come prepared, if I've prayed, if I've been trying to live the way of Jesus and be the hands and feet of Jesus, then when I come, I have a moment where I can hopefully quiet myself and listen. I think about church like a refueling station. If you've ever run a 5K or a marathon, they have a place where you can pick up water, keep running. That's what I like to think of this as. This is not a full meal. It's not everything you need for the week. It's not a complete, but it is definitely a place along this marathon, this journey of life for you to refuel, for you to get refreshed, to be encouraged, to maybe go back into Monday a little bit brighter. We have as a goal, whether it's kids ministry, and I talk to our kids ministry volunteers, or I talk to our kids director, Jessica, or I talk to Ben. It is all of our goal that this would be the best day of people's week, that we would have a role in shaping that, encouraging people, drawing them closer to God so that they can feel His presence, His love, His mercy, His grace. This is 1 hour out of 168 of your week, but we put a lot of effort to make it a powerful hour, because if you give less than 1% of your week, we believe it can fuel the other 99%. And now we need to talk about how. What is the intention behind that? Why is this the plan? Well, Augustine, one of the saints of the ancient church, he said it this way, Augustine of Hippo. He said, he cannot have God for his father who refuses to have church for his mother. So even in 400, they were talking about this concept of how difficult it is to live the Lone Ranger lifestyle. Even with monks and monasteries and, 400 AD, very much closer to the time Christ was living than when we are. But 400, they're talking about how powerful it is for people to gather, that the gathering of us together is powerful in ways that is difficult for us to completely understand. We can't go through it and enumerate all of it because it's very wide and it's very deep. But there's a lot to this gathering, more than just what appears on the surface. And so he said we've got to understand that the gathering is powerful, can be important, that the 1% of your week can literally make or break the 99 rest of your week, the other 160 hours that you're free to do whatever. That 1 hour that you give can really make a big difference. Again, it's not the full meal, it's not everything you need, but boy, it's a big boost of encouragement and hope and joy and peace that can make the difference and has throughout history made a huge difference. So I want to look with you in the scriptures today in Hebrews chapter 10, because there's an encouragement there that I find very valuable that is playing directly into what this talks about. And I'm actually going to start, I think, 23, verse 23. So it says in that verse, let us hold tightly without wavering to the hope we affirm, for God can be trusted to keep his promise. And then verse 24, let us think of ways to motivate one another to acts of love and good works. And let us not neglect our meeting together, as some people do, but encourage one another, especially now that the day of his return is drawing near. So even in the very, very young early church, they were already having people that were getting busy and saying, I just don't know if I can, the gathering of the people on a regular basis, I don't know if I can spare that time already. And so certainly I expect that in 2025, we're going to be in a very different place than that culture, and we're busier than ever, and we have more going on than ever. I know how difficult that can be to calendar that. But the word there was don't forsake. Don't give up. Don't stop meeting together, because this is a moment where you come together and you encourage one another. Now, I've had pushback on that sometimes. I've had people say, look, I just come to church, I sing the songs, I give, I shake some hands, but encourage, that's not my gifting. And that's okay. That may not be your primary gifting, like to go around and to talk to people, and maybe you're an introvert and that's not a big deal. But I want to challenge you that maybe you're thinking about the word encouragement as very one-dimensional. And there might be 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 dimensions to encouragement that you don't think about. I'll give you a case in point. I was inspired, as I said, to think about ministry in the church at a young age as a teenager. And so I started, my first job was for my home church as an intern. And I interned for them one summer in youth ministry. And I was working for the church, and I had a lot of big ideas, as you do when you're a young person. And the pastor quit 2 weeks before I started. And so I had to do the mail, and I had a lot of jobs that aren't typically an intern's type job. And so I was doing all these things. But that also meant that I had a lot more freedom to do some stuff. So I figured that a heavy metal concert would be good for a church in rural Oklahoma. It was unique. We knocked some stuff off the walls that night. It was very loud. But there was this elderly lady from the church, and she hated the music, just completely hated the music. Just was awful. But she was sitting in the very back row, and she was holding her ears the whole time and bobbing her head like this the whole time. And she was the only person from the church that showed up that was not like one of the teens. All the teens showed up. I mean, they brought a lot of friends. It was awesome. And she later, said to me, "That's not my kind of music, but they were Christians, and it was great to have them here, and it brought all the kids out." I'm like, "Thank you," and I'll never do that again. But it was awesome. It was really cool. And she didn't enjoy herself. She was not having a great time. But she, in her own way, was encouraging all the students that were there, because they were like, oh, there's someone that, clearly this is not for them, but they're there to encourage me. Their presence alone. How often do we think of our presence as being an encouragement? It was hugely encouraging to me to see an older saint, an older person in the church saying, not for me, but I'm going to support this. Think about what it's like when we can have cross-generational, when a child can come to church and worship with us, right? And see, let's say someone that's in 4th or 5th grade can see someone that is in high school a few years ahead of them, or someone in college that's a few years ahead of them that they look up to, or see a young parent, or to see a parent of teens, or to see someone that's an empty nester, or to see someone that's a senior adult. How powerful that cross-section of culture is of their world, because they interact with these people throughout the week, and then to see that the church is not limited to one kind of person, one age of people, but there's a diversity here, because what brings us together is not how alike we are, but what brings us together is this Jesus. Now that is interesting. So when I'm absent, someone might be missing out on that encouragement that God meant to deliver through me. And that becomes one of those moments, those teeth-clenching moments. Because maybe that was the day that that person needed that encouragement. In the psalm, if we roll back to Psalm 121, scripture Psalm 122 was in the video. If we roll back one psalm, it says, "I was glad when they said to me, 'Let us go to the house of the Lord.'" Glad means no one's twisting my arm. No one's coercing me to go. No one is forcing me against my will to go. No one is dragging me out of the house to go. And one of the most pleasant, wonderful things, how I know we're hitting our targets at Coffee Creek, is when children are upset to leave church. I love that. I just absolutely love that. If people were dragging their kids in, I would get real concerned. But when a child is like, Mom, I don't want to go home, I want to stay. That happened a couple weeks ago, and I was like, yes. I felt bad for the parent that was trying to drag their kid out. But secretly, I was like, nice. Yes, this is what we want. When we see a child that's like wanting to come, right, to be a part of the church, that is important. When I see dads bringing their kids, when I see moms bringing children and grandparents, all of those things go to this big idea of people that want to be a part of that. They're getting encouragement, and that is the goal of the gathering, is to come together in that way. And that's why when I talk to you about this Back to Church Sunday, I want you to be praying right now about someone that you could invite, someone that is right now sitting at home not thinking church is for them. Either they don't think they'd be welcome, like that guy we listened to, right? That video, they think someone would judge me for the way I'm dressed, or the way I act, or the words that I say. I'm rough around the edges, whatever, okay? Or they're thinking, this church isn't for me, or they're thinking God doesn't even want me in his place. And so we have to do work. There is real work involved in the translation, the transmission of that grace and that joy to other people that are absent of that right now. They do not have that in their life, but we could give that to them sometimes as simply as an invitation. Come sit by me. That is an encouragement, friend. That is an encouragement when you say, come sit by me. Not just, you should be going to church, right? Nobody wants to hear that. But hey, I go there. Come sit by me. That is a welcome. That is an invitation. Charles Spurgeon is a pastor of history that died a long time ago. And in 1892, he said this. He said, some Christians try to go to heaven alone in solitude. But believers are not compared to bears or lions, but to sheep. And sheep go in flocks, and so do God's people. I thought that was really interesting for him to say that. Sometimes we think it's the fight, don't we? I'm a bear, I'm a lion, I'm going to go out there and everybody's going to hear my opinion, right? That's kind of how our attitude is. But he said, no, that's not. We're not told that we're that. We're told that we are sheep. And sheep are rather simplistic animals, and the only hope they have of safety is to stick together, and they go in flocks. They go together. And they have a shepherd that watches over them, the great shepherd, but we are together in this. Or we are not, and we don't, and we miss out. So solitude is not what the Christian hope and faith is about. He says it's about being together. So the practice I want to talk to you about, and the challenge for this week, is to encourage others by showing up. And maybe that is encouraging someone in a time of grief. And maybe that's encouraging someone when they're going through a job loss or a painful time. Maybe it's encouraging with a new class, or they're struggling with a new skill set. And if you've ever been to school, you know how challenging that can be. There's a subject that probably jumps out to you still if you've been out of school a while like I have. I still think back to algebra, and I'm like, no, right? Just awful. And if you think back, there's probably a class or a subject that you just are like, this still gives you that dread. Right? So what would it be like to encourage someone in that, to show up for someone? You can do good by just committing to showing up. And if you don't have something on the calendar for that, then how about starting with this hour? How about starting with this and encouraging, using that opportunity to encourage others? It does you good, but I'm looking at it from the opposite side today. What if it does someone else good by you showing up? Then you being blessed is a happy benefit, right? A happy accident to that. But what if the point is that you're here to bless others? All of a sudden it changes the perspective, doesn't it? It helps you wake up easier. It helps you get that cup of coffee going and get on your way. It is a motivating factor. Because how exciting is it to be coming to a place where maybe a lot of people had a fine week. Maybe a lot of people are doing fine, but maybe there's 2 or 3 or 4 that are really struggling, that need to connect with God this week just to make it through this week. And what if I, in attending and showing up and being a part, maybe I'm serving, maybe I'm just being nice to someone, maybe I'm making eye contact, maybe I'm shaking someone's hand, maybe I'm saying, hey, my name is, whatever that looks like, maybe I get to play a small part in what God wants to do in their life. That's huge to me. Like, that's a big deal, to get to play even the tiniest, smallest role in their journey of connecting with God. That means I'm doing something way bigger than me, and I get to be a part of what he wants to do in their life. So, what would it look like to not just be physically present, but to come spiritually engaged? I think, obviously, there's simple things to do, to be prayed up, like I said, to have read through some scriptures this week, to have meditated on those thoughts, to come ready, not to come with a chip on my shoulder, but instead to come with an open heart. Who am I here to encourage? Maybe I asked that question in the parking lot as I'm walking up. Maybe I've prayed about that this week. Maybe I've invited someone, and maybe they haven't shown up, and I've invited them 12 times, but the 13th time, sure enough, they randomly showed up, and I better clean a seat off next to them and create a space. Like, what would that look like, to show up with intention and to be ready to encourage someone? I mention Bonhoeffer a lot, so some of you have made jokes over the years about how often I quote Bonhoeffer and Lewis, but Bonhoeffer is one of my favorites. He was a German theologian in what was called the Confessing Church in Germany. The church split in Germany when the Nazis came to power, and so there was a version of the church in Germany that supported the Nazis, and there was a version of the church that said, absolutely not, this is ridiculous, and worked against it and plotted against it. And Bonhoeffer was one of the key leaders. He actually died in captivity for his faith and for resisting National Socialism in Germany. And so a lot of us that have studied him over the years in his writings and his books have come to really love his work, because it wasn't written in a time of peace. It was written under duress. And one of the things that he really focused on, one of his imprisonments, he focused on this idea of the church. He felt like the church, kind of being dispersed, was really removing the key power, one of the key elements to the church that God had intended, the gathering of the people together. And this kind of individualism would pop up that would be very harmful. And I mean, if he could see our society today, he would just be pointing it out right and left, how harmful that can be when we do that. So he wrote this book called Life Together, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And I read it again this year, and I read it, but I love it because there's a lot to it that I still don't understand. And obviously it's German translated into English, and so there's probably some loss in translation, but I struggle with it because it's such a call to depth of community. It's such a call of sacrifice, of hobby, of industry, of wealth, of self to community. And it's beautiful and challenging and difficult to see in our current society at all. And that's why I keep reading it. But he says something that I thought would really help you kind of put this together today. He said it like this. He said, the physical presence of other Christians is a source of incomparable joy and strength to the believer. That there's nothing that really compares to that. Like, you can do every Bible study in the world. You can memorize every scripture. I knew a guy one time that could quote the entire book of John forwards, like just start John 1:1 and go all the way through, and without missing a beat, and you could just follow along. And I was like, man, I can't memorize very well at all. That's amazing. That's an amazing skill you have. But he said, you could know all the facts, and you could be really smart, and you could have a library of books, but you could still miss out on the key point of coming together with one another. Now think about this. He wrote this in 1939. That's before cell phones, that's before the internet, that's before streaming church online, that's before millions of cable channels and all the modern distractions we have. He wrote this. Even in that time frame, he saw it coming, that the distracted life and the life apart would be awful for the believer. The follower of Christ, it would not be fulfilling. And so, at the end of the day, this is what I've come up with for today, is I want us to think about this idea that when we gather, no one walks alone. So that's why we're doing this, so that no one has to think they're in this alone. It is heartbreaking to me when things happen and people don't have someone to lean on, right? And when life's going well, we don't think about it. But when we hit that rough spot, all of a sudden it becomes really relevant. So what if Coffee Creek was known as a church family where no one has to walk alone? Where we're actively inviting friends, not just to fill a room of people. Like, there's a lot of ways to do that, but what if we weren't thinking about it in that perspective, but we were thinking about it like, I'm thinking of one person that is walking life alone right now, and they are completely unprepared if they hit one of those valleys. And I don't want that for them. So we want great things for our community. We don't want people to feel alone. We don't want people to feel like they don't have someone to lean on. We instead want to be there for them. How can we do that? It begins right here, right now, in a space that we've dedicated. This space was built and dedicated to be a lighthouse in this community where people could connect with Jesus.